Yes.
My question is there something...
Let me try to remember that. Next time there's a question, let me let you do your thing.
All right, thank you. Is there something in the male brain that makes the male brain more adept at compartmentalizing? Like the fact that there's different hormones or the way that the brain is wired? And the other piece I want to say is that obviously women can compartmentalize too, and women have affairs and go
Yes.
visit masseuses and watch pornography and
Yes.
all of that too. So
Yes.
it's not just men who do this.
No, but I think women are able to integrate it better. I don't think it needs to be quite as separate. But those of you that are women, you could tell me that I'm wrong. I'm fine with that. One more comment about this, and I'm going to wait until you get the mic.
I was just listening to some guy who was a comedian through Facebook this morning, and he was talking about compartmentalization in men, and he said how, and we all do have that mechanism for potential, but that all men have, and they have boxes, and the boxes don't touch. And all men have one box with nothing in it.
Okay. Well, when Byzantine was going to write this book on the male brain, she told some of her female friends, and they said, "Oh, that's going to be a short book." Oh yeah. If you want to see all of the prejudices around men and women, go and look at greeting cards. That's where I see them. It's like, oh yeah, there's that stereotype. Oh yeah.
Can I just make one comment?
Well, you have the mic. I guess you can.
I have the mic. It's about what you were talking about earlier about masculinity and men having to win it over and over again.
Yes.
And there's such a high function of shame in that all the time.
Yes.
Shame of being, the worst thing you can do is call a man a girl.
Right.
Yeah. But you
boys as young as 3 learn that.
And you're only as good as your last pitch.
Exactly.
So at any moment your masculinity can be shamed right in front of everybody.
That's right.
So there's a horrible fear of shame in many men.
That's why I want to get to the Brene Brown article, which is about shame with men. Thank you. So I think that's all around compartmentalization, I'm going to say. It's tiring and wearisome to always compartmentalize, but some people do it for their entire lives. They really don't want the truth to come out. And there's a lot of shame, as you said.
I know you want to go on, but just before we move off to compartmentalize it, it might be useful. Thank you. It might be useful to think through what does compartmentalizing. What does that mean? I mean, isn't it possible that what's being touched there is the more than personal, and that in a sense we're all looking for that dimension, and compartmentalizing is a way of moving, is adding that, to the personal. So I haven't thought it through that much, but what is that suggesting symbolically to compartmentalize? I get the impersonal hit on it. For instance, a man or a woman, before she could sleep with her husband in the time of Ishtar, would have to go to the temple and sleep with the first man that came to the temple, thereby acknowledging her impersonal sexuality. Only then was she free to have a personal relationship. And so that dynamic might be going on there. It's just a thought.
Okay. Well, I did want to speak. I do think there are things. I think there are things in the brain, but I don't know quite what they are. Structures in the brain. I think of lateralization. I think of left hemisphere and right hemisphere for men, which makes compartmentalization easier. A guy named Michael Gurian believes that because we have to separate from our mothers, that we learn to compartmentalize at a very young age, and that in order to grow up to be self-respecting men, we need to separate from the mother and the softer feelings, which I think we've talked a little bit about already.
Excuse me? I have a quick question.
I need to move on.
Okay.
Sorry. I'm going to be sticking around after the talk if you want to talk a little more. Now what, you got up with the mic, so. The woman with
I
the
just
mic.
had was real confused on how hunting, gathering had to be compartmentalized.
Well, we have to kill things.
Yeah.
Well,
Maybe because I'm a hunter and my son
Yes.
is a hunter and that's all he thinks about is hunting, so he doesn't compartmentalize it.
yeah.
It's his life.
Yeah,
You know,
that's a good point. I'm not a hunter, so for me to kill something is, yeah.
Squash your empathy,
Correct.
proud of it.
Yeah. But I mean, you're talking about it in a very different context. And you're probably right that for hunters and gatherers, thousands of years ago, there wasn't a lot of conflict about it. Yeah. Good point. Emotional literacy. Women talk, men do. We've all heard that. Since we were little boys, we guys long for emotional connection. At the same time, we feel the need to pull away from mom, to be independent, aloof, test the limits. It's difficult for many men to know how to achieve these divergent goals. How do you retain the closeness with mom when you have to be a warrior? There was a time when the Vietnam War was going that there was a little button that you could wear that said, "I didn't raise my son to be a soldier." I don't know if any of you remember that. Emotional literacy involves the ability to name and identify our emotions, recognize emotional content of others, and understand the situations that produce emotions, also known as empathy. Girls get more encouragement to be emotionally literate. Boys learn early in life that expressing soft emotions, especially under stress, can bring ridicule from peers, or worse. They learn to cope with intense emotions with anger, aggression, or emotional withdrawal. Back in the 70s, we talked in the women's movement about women being on a pedestal. And feminists would say, it's not so great on a pedestal because you can't go very far. If you do, you'll fall off. Today, we talk about the man box and the box that men are in. And this is especially relevant for a men's movement kind of concept, that we are constrained by our role. And Brené Brown talks a little bit about this when she says that this is reinforced as much by women as it is by other men, that men stay in their designated role. So girls get more encouragement to be emotionally literate. Oxytocin drives a woman to talk in order to feel better, but men tend to put on masks. They have a corpus callosum in their brain that's 25% smaller than women. That's the part of the brain that connects the right and the left hemisphere. Men don't work through feelings using the language centers of the brain. Females have 6 or 7 language centers in the right and left hemispheres. Males may have only 1 or 2 in the left hemisphere. In relationships, she may sense his feelings before he does, and often before he can talk about his. This is frustrating for men because it feels like she is telling him what he's feeling. And those of you that do couples work, you might see this, and you might see why the man is getting irritated. Men have trained themselves to automatically turn off or disguise facial emotions. Acting cruel and hiding fear is one of the unwritten laws of masculinity. We've talked about this a little already. Emotional resonance with each other is soothing for women, and it increases the production of oxytocin. Men see feelings as impediments to solving a problem. Men have, you probably have heard of the mirror neuron system, which is what we all use for empathy. It's a way that I understand what you're feeling. Men do this initially and they switch over very quickly, partly because these are feelings of being powerless, of not being able to help. So they switch over to something called cognitive empathy, using the temporal parietal junction part of the brain. This is why women complain, I just wanted you to listen to me. You don't have to do anything. Well, it's almost intolerable to hear the problems and not want to do something. That's the way that I can help. So that's a pretty big disjuncture between men and women. Okay, I think I'll stop with that. Yes? 30 minutes left, and I wanted to talk very briefly about intimacy and vulnerability. I want to read something to you, and I want to ask you if you think this would be useful and effective for men. This is a quote from Sylvia Boorstein. It's easier than you think, the Buddhist way to happiness. Quote, one of the ways we build intimate relationships with other people is by sharing our fears with them, telling them the things that still frighten us. When we begin to appreciate the ways in which people have been frightened in their lives, we can be compassionate toward them rather than angry. Page 97. I don't want to deal with the mic, I just want to make this fast. So, any responses to that and how that would relate to men? Not well. Thank you. One of the ways we build intimate relationships with other people is by sharing our fears with them, telling them the things that still frighten us. When we begin to appreciate the ways in which people have been frightened in their lives, we can be compassionate toward them rather than angry. It's a lovely sentiment. But it doesn't apply very easily to men.
Try it in the military.
Try it in the military. Yeah. I was a conscientious objector, so I never got to go into the military. And I knew I didn't want to be put into a position where I had to kill somebody. So that's just a quick aside, but yeah, try doing that in the military. I believe that this may sound a little strange, but schools have been accused of being kind of feminine institutions. And I think sometimes that therapy is kind of a feminine institution. For better or worse, I've been in fields which always involved women. I was a volunteer coordinator, I was a teacher, now I'm a psychotherapist. It's almost like, you know, to be one of the gang, you need to be softer. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, it's good that I've learned to be softer. Sometimes my wife says things, I'll say something like, well, I did pretty well with that, didn't I? And she'll say, yeah, for a man. I always know that, you know, there's always a catch. But I've done enough talking, and I'd like to drink some water. So I'd like to ask someone to read a little bit from Brené Brown. It's called On How Research Evolves. And this is related to shame and men and her work around shame, which you probably are all familiar with. It's about a page long. When I was a kid, I got read to by my mother. I still like being read to, so I hope you don't mind.
And I love reading out loud.
Great. Go for it.
On How Research Evolves. For the first 4 years of my study on shame, I focused solely on women. At that time, many researchers believed, and some today still believe, that men and women's experiences of shame are different. I was concerned that if I combined the data from men and women, I'd miss some of the important nuances of their experiences. That I opted to just interview women, I confess, was partially due to my mindset that when it came to worthiness, women were the ones struggling. At some level, I also think my resistance was based on an intuitive sense that interviewing men would be like stumbling into a new and strange world. As it turns out, it was definitely a strange new world, a world of unspoken hurt. I got a glimpse into that world in 2005 at the end of one of my lectures. A tall, thin man, who I'd guess was in his early 60s, followed his wife to the front of the room. He was wearing a yellow Izod golf sweater, an image I'll never forget. I spoke with his wife for a few minutes as I signed a stack of books that she'd bought for herself and her daughters. As she started to walk away, her husband turned to her and said, "I'll be right there. Give me a minute." She clearly didn't want him to stay and talk to me. She tried coaxing him with a couple of come-ons, but he didn't. I explained, "Well, I haven't done many interviews with men. I just study women." And he nodded and said, "Well, that's convenient." I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up in defense. I forced a smile and asked, "Why convenient?" In the very high voice, why convenient? In the very high voice that I use when I'm uncomfortable. He replied by asking me if I really wanted to know. I told him yes, which was a half-truth. I was on my guard. Then his eyes welled up with tears. He said, "We have shame, deep shame. But when we reach out and share our stories, we get the emotion." Had touched me, but I was still trying to protect myself. Just as I was about to make a comment about how hard men are on each other, he said, "Before you say anything about those mean coaches, bosses, brothers, and fathers being the only ones," he pointed toward the back of the room where his wife was standing and said, "My wife and daughters? The ones you signed all those books for? They'd rather see me die on top of my white horse than watch me fall off. You say you want us to be vulnerable and real, but come on, you can't stand it. It makes you sick to see us like that." Holding my breath, I had this very visceral reaction to what he was saying. It hit me the way only truth can. He let out a long sigh, and as quickly as he had begun, he said, "That's all I wanted to say. Thanks for listening." Then he just walked away. I had spent years researching women and hearing their stories of struggle. In that moment, I realized that men have their own stories, and that if we're going to find our way out of shame, it will be together. And now that I've spent years studying men as well as women, I've come to believe that men and women are equally affected by shame. The messages and expectations that fueled shame are most definitely organized by gender, but the experience of shame is universal and deeply human. And thank you for letting me read.
Very nice. I know I'm not mic'd yet. Here I am. You can probably hear me anyway. All right. This is probably better. Thank you. What's your name?
Doreen Van Leeuwen.
Doreen, thank you for the nice reading. Me too, but at least you got to read it. So long. All right. Thank you. It is especially problematic for our male clients if they don't get respect. and if they don't respect themselves. So what I'd like to talk about next is working with men and what your experiences have been. And we will need the mic for this, because you can read what I've got, and hopefully you've had a chance to glance at that. It's in the handout, page 3. I can either go over this, or since you've read it, you can just ask me questions from it, or we can read it together and I'll go over it kind of quickly. The latter? Yeah. Okay. Treatment considerations, attitudes, ideas, techniques. Pacing, move slowly initially. That's what I do. Men test, and this will continue through the first phase of treatment. Move from content to process initially. It's safer for him. As treatment deepens, move more to process and our relationship with each other. You run the risk when you do this. I tend to be fairly slow and methodical when I don't know people very well. I don't want to make assumptions. But guys can be impatient. And if they don't get, quick results after 3 sessions, they may say, okay, good for you, so long. And so it's a dance. It's a delicate dance that we all do. Let me see if the mic will still work if I walk over here and get some water, because I'll keep talking. You think about it. You don't want to move too quickly. You've got all these things that you're supposed to do. It's okay. A friend of mine just wrote a book about working, she's at Dominican, and she wrote a book about interns and your first internship. And she talked a little bit about all the requirements when you work in an agency. I don't know how many of you have that, but doing history and forming rapport and making a connection. There's a lot to do in the very beginning, and there's a lot to do with men. And men are often not coming in because they really want to be there. I used to work with guys who were referred by probation. And so they didn't have a whole lot of choice in being there, and there's a theory around it. If you don't want to be in therapy, you're not going to get much out of it. So I would do my best to help them find a reason that this could be useful for them. And I always thought that when they got into trouble, it was their ticket to getting help, because they couldn't ask for it. It was commanded by the court. And in a way, that gives a guy an out. Now, if it's not the court, it could be his wife, it could be his girlfriend. So I tend to move slowly in the beginning, and that's my style. It may not be yours. Second is non-judgmental position. He's anticipating criticism, judgment, and scorn. That's what I consider in the beginning. And sometimes he's his harshest critic. So I reframe how coping strategies involve courage or strength. I empathize. Help him identify his feelings. What a concept. You guys all have a feeling chart somewhere in your office? I mean, sometimes even that is a revelation, just to see that. Ooh, that's a lot of feelings. Plus, you can have them at the same time. That too. I expect that he's a victim of abuse. I don't put that out, I just think it. Men often deny or minimize or don't even recognize abuse when it happens. That line again, the fish are the last to discover the ocean. This is just the way it was. This is the way I grew up. This is the way it was, all the guys got treated. So it may take a few months of therapy before even we can broach the subject that, well, maybe that was abusive. Yes?
I bring up hypervigilance
Uh-huh.
as a way of working in their feelings, and it's worked with him. I bring up hypervigilance. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Okay, hypervigilance.
Good.
It's kind of like my way into working with feelings, especially I've worked with a few teenagers.
Uh-huh.
And before I can tell they come in because they're having anxiety and
Yeah.
all this. And so I say, You know, it sounds a lot like a term I use is hypervigilance. Like when you were little, you had to be really aware of all these things, and that has been a way to get them to talk about a situation. They
Good.
usually pick a young situation,
Yeah.
and often a lot of very unsafe situations, and they
Yeah.
realize they seem more receptive
Yeah.
to thinking about, oh yeah, I'm hypervigilant because I had to look and I had to figure it out.
Yeah.
Before they get into the feeling part.
Good, I like that. I think, talking to kids, they would listen to how Dad was walking up the stairs, to be able to tell if he was drunk or not. And they would know the mood as soon as he came in the door as to whether you could ask him for something or you should leave him alone. Households where people tiptoed around family members. So that's good.
I noticed that men seem to gravitate toward talking about their fathers and their relationship with their fathers.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you find that they have a harder time being not loyal to their mothers and not protecting that relationship and addressing those issues.
Not protecting their mothers. The client or the...
Or if they're not in therapy, either way, man.
I don't know if I'm understanding the question, because I do think that men have a lot of problems with their fathers. But you're asking if they feel what about their mothers?
If they feel more protective and more loyal to their mothers and have a harder time addressing the difficulties in that relationship and the trauma that they experienced with their mothers than women do. It seems like they have an easier time being in that sort of competitive and, this is what my dad did kind of perspective. I mean, I noticed that women tend to focus more on the relationship with their mothers, and it's easier to say my perspective, but I don't work with tons of men, I just have a few, and I was just thinking that when you were just talking about
So
something
have
a
you
minute
heard
ago.
that and experienced that with the men that you've worked with?
Yeah, but I don't have past experience.
Yeah,
so.
yeah.
I have too. I've experienced that with men. They're protective of their mothers.
I'd say it varies. There's a lot of specifics that might affect that quality. Does the boy identify with the father? Does he side with the father? There's so much, when there's tension between mom and dad, there's so much pressure to take sides. And one of the things that I dealt with as a kid from a divorced home was, I refused to take sides. And to me, it was part of my salvation. It was part of surviving. But not everybody does that. And sometimes dad is such a schmuck that it's easy to be pissed off at him. But, for a boy, that's your role model.
My experience has been with when the mother is abusive, the boy or the man wants to defend his mother. He doesn't want to attack. He backs off from attacking her.
I think that's a survival mechanism. Yeah. So let's see. I talked about normalizing his thinking and shame. I wanted to say something about that. Sex offenders come in with a lot of shame. It's not always clear if they feel ashamed because they got caught or because what they did was wrong. For them to understand what they did was wrong is usually a process, and it's a pretty important one, and it's consequential. But it can happen. I don't believe because someone has committed a sex offense against a child, for example, or a rape against a woman, that he's incurable. I don't believe that, I think the very small percentage of people who commit sex offenses are true pedophiles. But this is another talk. But oftentimes people think that what they've done is who they are. And I want to change that conception with guys who have done something which is horrible. Because I want something to work with. There are many, often sex offenders are very nice people who have a lot of good social skills. And they have things that are redeeming qualities. And I need to find those and help them to see them. And even guys who act out sexually, having affairs, got a young man who videotaped a girl, never put it on the web, but she found out, she walked out, didn't want to have anything to do with him. He's got a lot of shame around that. He'll have to live with that shame the rest of his life. Shame doesn't just disappear. I think it's like a wound. I still have a scar from a knife wound that my brother inflicted on me. And we were just goofing around. He just shouldn't have gotten the knife at that age. But we were goofing around, that I can get by you. Well, I couldn't. So it cut to the bone. I tried to hide it because I didn't want my mother to find out, and I didn't want him to get in trouble. I couldn't find anything that would wrap it up very well, so I found a tampon from my mother. What did I know? I used that, and after a while it started getting infected. It was red. It was not looking good. I had to tell my mother. She took the knife away from him. I went to the doctor. I got stitches. I still have the scar on my hand. It's a reminder of that. We all have scars. I live with it. I've turned it into a story. Not bad. I asked my brother about it before he died, and he didn't remember. That's how he dealt with it. Challenge respectfully. Early on, men usually appreciate this. I use a Columbo approach sometimes with a pretense of uncertainty that questions how effectively his coping strategies have really addressed the presenting problems. You know who Columbo is? Yeah. I don't understand this. You thought that by having an affair, I don't know, whatever the story is, you complete the line. That would make things better, you know? Also, I'll hear things about, that's the way I've always been. And I'll say things like, so is it written in concrete? Were you born that way? How did that get to be? And if it's something that you learned, you think it's something you could change. So, you know, I take that attitude. There's this line, if you always do what you've always done, you know the rest of it? And you always get what you always got. An intern taught me that. I love that. I use it all the time. And it is not another definition of insanity. That is a different concept. And you probably have heard that one too. Later in treatment, when I'm badgering someone or I'm bringing something up that they don't want to talk about, here's something that I just want you to consider. I try to think about what we're not talking about. What are we not discussing that would be important? And then when I come to that, I might ask it. So when I talk about something that somebody like, you know, you said you were going to stop smoking, you said that last week, you said that last month, you've said that for a year, then I get called an asshole. And I say, yeah, I can be an asshole sometimes. I don't know if that's therapeutic. Sometimes I just feel like he's turning me into a nag. And, you know, he's been there, done that. I'm always looking for a different way to get in, to have an impact. Somebody had their hand up. Yeah.
Well, I was just wondering if you had any special or favorite ways of living. Okay. Approaches to working with, let's say, a 27-year-old with anger issues who's drinking instead of anger. So not the drinking part necessarily, but, you know, difficulty with anger, but high-end, difficult with frustration and anger. And how men, boys, what they like. How do they like to work with that?
With anger?
Yeah.
Well, I do a lot around anger because men are angry. And I use a model which I took from domestic violence, which is like a clock. And we talk about the buildup. And I want people to be able to identify the feelings that they're having before they explode. I want them to see that it's a process and it just doesn't happen. Guys tell me they go to 0 to 100 in a second with their anger. And I ask them, well, was it always like that? And sometimes they'll say, yeah, it seems like it. And one of the things we're working on is how do you put the brakes on that? How do you anticipate that it's coming? What are the situations that bring up that anger? And what's the sequelae? Because most of the time, men feel they feel guilty that they have exploded. And I talk to them about, well, if you wanted to make an impact, if you wanted to communicate a message, what you're now doing is your recipient is only focusing on your anger, and they're defensive. They're not really getting what you're upset about. They're just defensive. So, it's a process. We talk about this kind of stuff, and I think that it's useful. I've worked a lot with men and helped them to reduce their anger, especially in the moment. Taking a time out is really important. Hope that addresses it a bit. Psychoeducation, convey that treatment is a marathon, not a sprint. It took you years to develop this thinking and behavior. I use handouts, poetry, quotations, movies when relevant. Some people really appreciate this, some people don't. When I see that they don't, I just don't do it anymore. It's an approach, but some guys don't like to read. If you give them something to read, that's not going to work. Self-disclosure, brief and judicious, reduces distance and competition. Because first time I went to see a therapist, it was a guy, and the first thing I thought of was, I don't want to talk to this guy. He's got it better than I do. So I saw a woman, and it was much better. Those of you that are women here, you can do very well with men. You can't be one of the guys, but you can be a nurturing female figure. And we men need that. I just appreciated that my therapist, who was an intern at the time, was quiet and would let me talk. She listened. That was really important. I'm not as good at that, I tell you. I wish I was. Yes?
I find that just the act of going to therapy for a man goes against all of the training, because you're now going to someone for help. You're acknowledging vulnerability and weakness, which is shameful.
Right.
So, and men feel that, and also there's a lot of sort of popular press about a lot of men's stuff is sort of ridiculous, and so there's more shaming. Mm-hmm. So I think, I find that it helps to give men recognition that their strategies, mm-hmm. their masculinity overdone, has a purpose and got them somewhere. Mm-hmm. And it's not very relational. It causes problems in relationships. So mm-hmm. not try to take it away or shame them for it, give them credit for it, mm-hmm. and then open up other doors. I think that approach works for me with men.
Good.
Yeah.
I agree. I like to reframe it. I like them to see that it's courage, that it's strength, that it's going against the grain in a way. I'm working with a guy now, he's 44 and he's in recovery, and he's learning a whole new way to be in the world, and it's very difficult because it's a much more feminine way. And he doesn't associate, he's a very robust, he's kind of like a Labrador retriever, he's just all over there, he's got lots of energy. I don't know if you think about your clients as either animals or as children, but I do both. I think, well, what was this person like when they were a kid? I used to do groups. Some of you are aware of that, and I'd see everyone sitting in the group, and I would mostly be quiet, but I'd think, I wonder what they were like when they were 5, and what they'd be doing in this group now if they were 5. And dogs. Think about dogs, people and dogs, especially guys. We're all in this together. Explain I'll likely make mistakes and invite them to tell me when I do. This deepens the relationship, shifts the power dynamic. I know, it's getting late. Sense of humor, life is an adventure, impromptu role plays. I do all that. Time's up. All right, everybody. Thank you for your attention.